spelled HERSCHELSCHACTER, at the Beit Meir world headquarters of the World Mizrahi movement in Jerusalem on February 13th, 1973. Rabbi Schachter, let's begin first with some identification. You were chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations. I think that's the correct name. Major American Jewish Organizations from
2 years of 1968 to 1969.
69, and you were also a member of COJO.
Yes, representing the President's Conference, I attended and participated in the meetings of COJO. In the years of 1970 and 1971, I was the chairman of the National Conference on Soviet Jewry in the United States.
Okay, fine, thank you. Now, what we'd like to do is simply trace some of the major occurrences which you recall of your joint work with the late Yaakov Herzog. I'd like you to begin by telling me just freely how you originally met him and when you began to work closely together, and then you can take it from there. Please go ahead.
Well, actually, I had known the late Dr. Herzog superficially. We had sort of a peripheral acquaintance with one another over the years from his visits to the United States. But actually, I came to know him much more intimately and to work with him more closely once I became chairman of the President's Conference. He came to America during the beginnings. I mean, he was a very frequent visitor to America. But I remember particularly his visits when I assumed the chairmanship of the President's Conference, at which time we discussed a variety of matters that he felt he should bring to the President's Conference in plenum as well as in individually private discussions. The major thrust of our discussions during the latter part of 1968 were centered around his plans for the historic Prime Minister's Conference that was convened in Jerusalem in January 69. I remember vividly many discussions because a number of the organizations that were affiliated with the President's Conference looked with some measure of reluctance, hesitation. They didn't quite know what might come out of such a conference, and therefore were a little fearful about lending the full and unlimited support or commitment of their respective organizations to this kind of a historic venture. The manner in which he handled the questions, specifically, we sat meeting after meeting, and the problems of the centrality of Israel for some of the non-Zionist organizations within the President's Conference was always an issue. As a matter of fact, I think even you once sat in on a meeting when somebody who at the moment will remain nameless raised this question of the centrality of Israel. And you handled him beautifully. But these were the questions that Yakov always dealt with, and the fact remains that the Prime Minister's Conference did take place, and of course was the historic achievement that it was.
But what did Yakov want to achieve at this conference? What was his vision of it? It was his idea, you feel, which he conveyed to the Prime Minister. What was his vision of it, and how did he express that to you, privately and publicly?
Privately, even more so than publicly. Yakov told me on several occasions, and without any fanfare and without any drashot, of his deep, abiding commitment to the concept of Klal Yisrael. We know of his personal religious sentiments. We know of his own deep ties to Torah and to the traditional way of Jewish life. yet his heart was so broad and his mind so all-inclusive that he included every aspect and every facet of Jews, of Judaism, of Jewishness, of Kol mi asher b'shem Yisrael yechoneh. And actually this was the purpose of the conference. He wanted, in the 20th year of Israel's existence, to bring about this mighty demonstration of the centrality of Israel, the priority of Israel on the agenda of world Jewry, of every organization, of every shade and opinion. And you will recall, as I certainly vividly recall, the broad spectrum from Agudat Yisrael on the right, and Agudat Yisrael in America is incidentally not affiliated with the President's Conference, and yet were more than thrilled and honored to accept the invitation which I conveyed to them on behalf of the Prime Minister to attend and participate in the deliberations of this conference. So it was from Agudat Yisrael, and of course other religious groupings, all of the secular groupings, all of the Zionists, all the religious, all the fraternal, the civil defense agencies in America and in other lands, the total spectrum of world Jewry. This is what he wanted to achieve, and this is what he did achieve in bringing together the authentic, responsible leadership of the totality. And this, I keep emphasizing this because I believe that it was really unprecedented. Look, we know that there are Zionist congresses that bring together Jews from all over the world, but these are Zionist Jews. There are conferences on economic needs. These are attended by philanthropists, by big givers, but a conference that cuts across every aspect, every vestige, every element of Klal Yisrael, I think was unprecedented and has not been repeated.
A couple of questions on that, and I thank you. I think this is the kind of material we need. Did Yakov ever use the term covenant? And what I mean is, after 1967, there was a tremendous upsurge. And here was a kind of world Jewish gathering, as you say, unprecedented, which in a sense was making a covenant among itself, and with Israel as well. Did he ever use that term? He was always very careful, not to over-exaggerate those things. That's one thing. And secondly, could you tell us which organizations specifically outside of the President's Conference? President's Conference was what, 23 organizations or 21?
In my day it was 24.
24. Well, I won't ask you to tell us what those 24 are. We can look that up. But which ones he added on? But the first question was on the covenant.
Well, let me dispose of the latter technicality. I think that the only two organizations that were very prominently associated with the Prime Minister's Conference that were not actually, technically, members of the President's Conference were, interestingly enough, on the one hand, Agudat Yisrael, and on the other hand, American Jewish Committee, which is, of course, a very prestigious organization in the United States, which has a working relationship with the President's Conference, but is not actually and specifically part of the President's Conference. There were other...
Council of Federations.
Well, Council of Federations is affiliated with the President's Conference. As we're talking, I recall, for instance, there were some educational agencies that were invited to the Prime Minister's Conference, like Torah Umesorah, which is the National Association for Hebrew Day Schools in America, primarily an Orthodox-oriented body. I think the American Association for Jewish Education, which is a broader body, was invited. But again, not
this was at his request, wasn't it?
Absolutely. If I may say, it was perhaps, in a personal sense, I may have had something to do with that, because I felt that it was important within the United States to give a greater measure of visibility to those organizations that were dealing with chinuch and with intensive, positive, maximal Jewish education. Now to come back to the other, more philosophical problem of covenant. He did use that term, he used that term because, again, he felt that to give lasting expression to this ideal that motivated his thinking and much of his life, there certainly was in reality such a covenant. He was careful. I don't really recall, I too want to be careful now, I don't really recall the circumstances under which he formulated his concept of covenant, whether it was ever reduced to writing. But I recall him talking of the need for a covenant between Am Yisrael Batfutzot im Ha'am HaShochen B'Tzion, in drawing up the summation, or the statement that summarized all that was expressed by the variety of people who were at the Prime Minister's conference. I'm sure that statement is available. I can't recall it Baal Peh, but I remember what impressed me was how beautifully he wove into the fabric of those words references to religious, moral, spiritual values, emphasizing and underlining the significance of the religious and cultural heritage of our people, which serve as a foundation for Jewish unity. And yet he did it in a manner that was not only stylistically elegant, but that was almost politically prudent, in that there was no expression that would be in any way contrary to the feelings, to the sentiments of those who perhaps had a more secularist orientation of Jewish life. Generally, if I may extend for a moment on this aspect, the fact is that with his complete and genuine commitment to the religious aspects of Jewry, he yet was so careful never to offend, always to bring to an expression his religious commitments in a manner that would attract, that would win respect, rather than ever trying to impose views that others might not share.
On that conference, he had a very difficult job. In the United States, first of all, to try to find a minimal basis of cooperation with all the spectrum of the Jewish organizations, including those you mentioned, whose expressed relationship to Israel was less intense than others. And then in Israel he had the second problem of not only giving expression at the conference to different shadings, but also being concerned with the geographical distribution and representation. If you remember, you were on the presidium of the conference. Yes. Maybe you'll come back and see if you can recall any particular crisis or incident relating to one of the organizations. You can mention names of individuals and organizations, because whatever eventually will be published will be vetted by you, and what stays in the files you can...
Well, actually, maybe it's psychological that I really don't remember the negatives and the shadows and the inevitable little personal squabbles and the constant fight for visibility and the relentless struggle of mi barosh and who gets how much time to speak before the plenum. These, of course, we know from all international conferences are the weaknesses with which we must struggle. I don't really recall. There was a pretty good formula worked out in that the conference was being called by the existing roof organizations in the various countries of the world. And thank God, I think we've reached the point now in international Jewish affairs where in every large segment, or even in the smaller communities, sometimes even more so in the smaller communities than in the larger, but we've reached the point where there are authentic coordinating roof organizations, certainly in the most complex of all Jewish communities in the United States, which has so often been referred to as an organizational jungle. The fact is that I would say, Baruch Hashem, the President's Conference has emerged as a very viable and effective instrument for coordinating the attitudes, opinions, and action programs of the overwhelming majority of the organized Jewish community, particularly, and not only particularly, I would say that perhaps a large, if not the sole measure of its success is due to the fact that it deals exclusively with areas of foreign affairs, if I may say, rather than any domestic issues. I'm sure that if ever we attempted to introduce a domestic issue around the table of the President's Conference, it would blow right up. Domestic American issue, of course. It would blow up because every one of our organizations has their own programs and their own attitudes. But insofar as the collective view of the American Jewish community vis-a-vis the security of Israel, there may still be shadings, there may be differences of opinion as to what might be the most effective methods for public relations for selling Israel's image and needs, all of these other areas. But insofar as the central issue of Israel's security, there was always consensus, and we were able to operate. So that in terms of Israel, President's Conference for the United States, and then the other similar organizations that exist around the country, so that when you ask the question as to, do I recall any very sharp clashes, not really. The Presidium was set up by territorial representation, so that if I was a member of the Presidium, it was because I was then the chairman of the President's Conference, which meant that I was the spokesman for the American contingent. There were those from Europe, from South America, from various parts of the world.
Rabbi Schachter, could you recall any specific incident where you spent more time with Dr. Herzog on an individual basis rather than in committee?
Yes, very much. There were several occasions, but let me recollect and reminisce about one specific occasion. We attended a meeting of COJO in Geneva.
Do you remember when, by chance?
This must have been the summer of 69. Summer of 69.
Before the Prime Minister?
No, it was after the Prime Minister. After the Prime Minister's conference. And we, quite by accident, met in the kosher restaurant, and after having dinner together, he suggested that we walk back to our hotel rather than hop a cab. And that walk that perhaps would normally take 40 or 50 minutes ended up in a leisurely stroll of some 3.5 to 4 hours. Interestingly enough, I would just like to mention, which should be erased after it's heard, that when we finally got back to the hotel, we walked into a sort of a bar in the hotel, and it was then about 11 o'clock at night, and all we had, of course, were just 2 Cokes. And lo and behold, who was sitting there with a very beautiful young woman, but the president of COJO. Okay, and it was quite interesting, and he smiled and acknowledged our presence and went about his business. Okay, now this walk was really, I would say, the only time in all of the years that I knew the late Yakov when we had a warm heart-to-heart chat, completely alone over an extended period of time, as I say, about over 3 hours. Part of the discussion he devoted to me, as it were. He was deeply concerned about the status of religion in Israel, about the status of the rabbinate in Israel. And
what bothered you?
The fact that there was such the hiatus, the pa'ar in the community, that he who was certainly born and raised and lived in and with the rabbinate all of his life, from the days of his own blessed sainted father, And the moments in his own life when he was toying with the idea of perhaps actually becoming a practicing rabbi, he felt that more different people should be brought into the country, and it may be immodest for me to say so, but he felt that perhaps I would be the kind of a person among others who should come to this country and actually serve in the rabbinate, that there were rabbinic posts open that he felt I could qualify for, that I could make a real contribution to speak the language of the people, of the younger people, to express a concern for all that was happening in the land, to be aware, alert, interested in the totality of society, pretty much of the kind of role that effective rabbis play in America or in other Western countries, a role that unfortunately rabbis in Israel do not yet play. There are exceptions, I know. He felt that I might have a contribution to make, but that was addressed to me. But then he expanded even more fully on his role, his contributions to the strengthening of Torah and Torah institutions in Israel. He was very much concerned in that discussion about the future of Jewish youth in various Western countries. This was a subject to which he returned time and time again, of what needs to be done, the materials that need to be published. That, of course, was the time when the New Left was at its height, and when threats to Jewish survival and Jewish identity among broad segments of the student youth in campuses across the world, when all that was going on, the utter permissiveness, the recklessness, the complete denunciation and denigration of Jewish values, of Israel's status, all of that we encountered in those days that are not completely gone, but that are, thank God, a little less threatening today than they were then.
What did he suggest should be done vis-a-vis the youth outside of Israel?
He really didn't have any specific formula. I don't think it's fair to ask of anybody to provide a panacea for this kind of devastating problem. A problem that could only solve itself by burning itself out, as we are witness to at this very moment. But nonetheless, he did not feel that we can just sit idly by and let it vanish of itself. The victims were too many, and we have lost undoubtedly many young people who have fallen prey to the propaganda of Al-Fatah because of the New Left and its denigration of Jewish interests on the part of Jews themselves. But he did feel he had plans. He himself wanted to write. He wanted to get people who were qualified to write on these subjects. He told me, I remember quite specifically, of an offer given to him by a wealthy Jew in England who was prepared to subsidize a publication in various languages if it were properly prepared with answers, with a direct frontal confrontation with these challenges.
In other words, his response was to try to marshal the intellectual material and historic material which could be presented to the youth.
That's pretty much of what he had in mind. I don't know that he actually ever translated this aspect of his hope into any concrete realities.
He began writing a book on the history of Israel, which he wrote one very fine chapter, just for your information. But please go ahead.
Yeah. So we talked about the problems of those elements of Jewish youth around the world that were slipping away, whose Jewish identity was largely being denied by themselves, certainly minimized. Then we got to talk again and again about Torah in Israel, about maximal Jewish religious education, and the role of yeshivot, and the role of B'nai Torah. And again, here was a man whom all of us knew and admired as one who lived in the larger world, in the world of modern culture and the most urbane, sophisticated well-read, most articulate, and yet I remember a Shabbat that I spent having lunch. My family and his family had Shabbat lunch together at the home of his wonderful mother. May God increase her years. And we got into talking as traditional Rabbanim sit around the Shabbos table, and we talked divrei halacha, divrei Torah, and I was amazed. My son, who was with me and who is somewhat of a Ben Torah, he was at that time a student here at the Mira Yeshiva in Yerushalayim, and he was amazed at the scope and depth of his phenomenal memory, Givof mit Gemores, as we say. He was so deeply concerned with strengthening even the more, for lack of a better term, the rightest elements in the yeshiva world. Elements that don't, unfortunately, look with too much of a positive attitude upon the Medina and upon the broader circles that are dominant in Israeli life. I remember vividly one incident, and this, I'm still talking about the walk that we took that night in Geneva, but let me just put this in because it comes to my mind in this context. After the Prime Minister's conference, some time later, I was here and met with him, as I did whenever I came here, and he said to me that he wants me to meet with the Minister of Finance, with Pinchas Sapir, and we discussed the subject that was to be discussed. And the subject that he wanted me to take up with the Minister of Finance was the absolute urgency for implementing a resolution adopted unanimously at the Prime Minister's conference calling for the strengthening of Jewish education around the world, but principally calling for motivating in much greater measure masses of young Jews in various countries of the world to come to spend at least 1 year of study in Israel. He, Yaakov, alav shalom, insisted, and did it very carefully and very tactfully, that the intent of this resolution, I don't recall now whether the wording appeared in the resolution or it was solely his Torah Shebal Peh, his oral interpretation, that when the resolution called for support on the part of the government to make possible the absorption of greater numbers of students from various parts of the world to come to study in Israel, that this included not only universities, but it included students who came here from different countries to study in yeshivot, mature young adult men who came from a variety of backgrounds and who sought the hishtalmut in Talmud and in rabbinic literature that they could get in the yeshivot in Israel and not in the countries of their origin. Mr. Sapir agreed to that principle. I presented it certainly to the principle that there should be equality between students of yeshivot and students of universities, that the Talmidei HaYeshivot mechutz la'aretz should enjoy the same benefits, the same subsidies, the same accommodations where necessary. In short, whatever the government was prepared to do for university students who came to spend a year or two here, they are prepared to do for yeshiva students. And I don't know what the matzav is at this precise moment, but I would imagine that this arrangement is still in effect, which means actually that yeshivot and students of yeshivot were encouraged to come here. Local yeshivot were encouraged and given the means to absorb additional students, and generally this made for a marvelous contribution, because I can tell you without hesitation, I know for an absolute incontrovertible fact that many of the students who came initially for a year or two to study in yeshivot came back. I don't want to be partisan. I'm not qualified to establish any kind of a survey as to what proportion of yeshiva students came back to stay as against what proportion of university students came back to stay. But I'm almost ready to stick my neck out and say that the proportion of yeshiva students who either remained or came back to stay is greater in fact than of university students.
The interview continues on Wednesday, February 14, at the home of Avraham Avichai. Rabbi Schachter, we were up to the long walk you had taken with Dr. Herzog in Geneva, and what he had discussed with you about his own role in strengthening what I think you called it Torah life in Israel through his own work.
Yes, of course. He pointed out, and it was not just a matter of vanity or immodesty on his part, but in matter-of-fact tones, he pointed out a variety of occasions and incidents when the unique position which he enjoyed, the trust and the confidence that he was able to evoke on the part of government officials, enabled him to bring about a positive attitude towards strengthening Torah institutions in Israel on the part of those elements that admittedly are really far removed from a personal commitment to any kind of religious way of life or religious study. But yet in his own quiet and persistent manner, he was able to utilize the role that he played and, as I said, the confidence that he was able to achieve in order to strengthen these institutions. Now, specifically, he told me of the project which I noticed only today, driving back from Tel Aviv as we were approaching Jerusalem, great big sign of this Kiryat Tel's stone. This goes back now quite a number of years that the Tel's Yeshiva in Cleveland undertook to initiate a project here on the outskirts of Jerusalem to build a great yeshiva and other various facilities for dwellings and so on. At that time, there was need for very, very substantial sums. I don't know the details, but I do know that he was directly responsible for persuading the powers that be within the Israeli government not only to match. This has become frequent practice now, where government matches sums that are donated, contributed by various philanthropists around the world for institutions in Israel, but even more than matching, that much of the land and the projects for construction were approved and to a very substantial degree, I think running into the millions of pounds, these projects were supported by the Israeli government.
Just on that point, how would you describe the general attitude of the Tel Aviv Yeshiva towards Israel, and did that come into the discussion at all with Dr. Herzog?
Yeah, I must say that I pointed out to him, and I did it not surely I share his devotion to Torah institutions of every variety, but I did point out to him that I was a little surprised that I knew that the yeshiva in Telz, as many other yeshivas around the world, were not very positively disposed toward Zionism, toward Medinat Yisrael. As a matter of fact, they were largely engaged in inculcating a very critical, if not downright negative attitude toward the Medina and toward its leaders and toward everything that it stood and stands for. And I said there are, thank God, many Torah institutions in Israel and around the world that have a very positive Zionist orientation, and that certainly do perpetuate and inculcate a strong feeling of identity with and devotion to the state, that I was surprised that here he was going out of his way in the case of this particular school. I don't want to make them the target, but it wasn't only this school. There are so many, many schools that, as I say, have this negative attitude and yet were truly and very substantially assisted by his efforts in their behalf with the government. Would it not have been more logical and more consistent if he had utilized his influence and had exercised his strength for those institutions that more faithfully reflected his own views and his own attitudes toward Torah and the Medina? His reaction was swift in coming, and he told me over and over again that he has no partisan feeling about these things, that he feels that every manifestation of genuine Torah scholarship would enrich the cultural life of the Medina. Of course, he did not agree with those who were so quick to denounce and denigrate many aspects of the political life of this country. He would hope that more and more people would assume a positive attitude and would not create the kind of almost Kulturkampf that leads us into so many other areas of discussion. Of course, he would have wanted to see that, but nonetheless, he was so committed to the study of Torah for those who wanted to study Torah, for those who were dedicated to the study of Torah, that he felt they deserved and merited his support and the support of the Medina. So that he pointed out to me on many occasions, and particularly that night when we were talking, how many schools, yeshivot, the various shades of opinions, were the direct beneficiaries through a variety of channels, were nonetheless the direct beneficiaries of his intervention with various sources within the government of Israel.
You also mentioned to me about Ishibata Kotel.
Yeah, this I'm glad you reminded me of. We talked about that a great deal immediately after the Six-Day War. Rabbi Neria and a number of his students and disciples determined to move right into the old city and establish a Makom Torah within that, the old historic Rova Yehudi, and they occupied what was known as the Batei Machzeh. And I was there myself very shortly after the Six-Day War and saw the terribly primitive conditions that prevailed, but yet there were many weeks when these youngsters were the sole inhabitants of the old city. They were the only Jews who were living in the old city, and it required a great deal of heroism on their part and obviously very severe inconveniences, but nevertheless they moved in. Their act was not looked upon with too much favor in government circles and military circles. At that time, apparently, the ruling circles in the country were a bit fearful, and they were reluctant to create any situation that would upset or would exacerbate the international opinion, and there were understandable reasons why there was a reluctance on the part of the government to see this kind of development in the old city. Rabbi Neria persisted, and I know for a fact that again it was Dr. Herzog's intervention, it was his gentle power of persuasion that motivated the then Prime Minister, the late Levi Eshkol, to authorize not only the fact that these young men were not to be disturbed from their quarters, but he, I recall in fact once when I personally discussed with the late Prime Minister Eshkol the problem of the future of this yeshiva, and he authorized allocation of a very important parcel of land for the yeshiva. In fact, as of this date that we are sitting and talking, that land is already being developed, and I think there is actual construction going on already in building this yeshiva, which, again, not single-handedly and not solely, but in very large measure, owes its status to the effort of the late Dr. Herzog.
This interview continues on tape number 263. The interview continues on tape 263. At the King David Hotel on February 6, 1973. Mr. Carter, do you remember the first time you met the late Yakov Herzog?
I don't remember exactly the first time. I imagine it was sometime in 60 or 61. But the first time that we worked closely together was in 67 and early 68.
You were then American chairman of the preparatory committee, I think it was called, for the economic conference. Is that right?
That's right.
And if I remember correctly, that was a job you took on in the spring of 67.
Got it right.
Is that right? Before the Six-Day War, in other words.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
No. It was after.
It was after the Six-Day
Yes,
War.
it was shortly there, because the first meeting that we had on that was in August of 67.
Right.
Here, there were
Right.
some 65 people from all over the world. And that from there, we started working as a committee. And I was chairman of the American section. And from there, we went to organize for the first conference of April 68.
Okay. And I suppose your meetings with Herzog were originally then in the United States.
No, there were, when I came here, whenever I would come here, I would visit with him in his office. And the first thing that I would come here, I would sit down with Yakov and we would discuss all the problems, and he would lay out the problems as he saw them, and we would discuss them and try to work them out.
What was his role in putting across the main idea of the conference? Insofar as you personally are concerned, I mean.
Well, Yakov had a great ability to understand the necessity of having all the Jews of the diaspora from all different areas sort of blended together into one. And he was constantly, in the back of his mind, there were constant thoughts and directions of trying to work it out so that every country, every region, and every continent would be properly represented and would properly fit into the overall conference.
I imagine there's a lot of diplomatic skill involved in making sure to give every important person and every important region his due, but without making the whole thing crushing in terms of, let's take it in terms of the April conference. planning that thing out. Do you remember something about the planning for the sessions that you were involved in?
Oh, yes, I remember very clearly when we used to sit and discuss the number of speakers that would be at the opening session. And it seemed like usually the plenary sessions here require many speeches. And I'm not accustomed to too many speeches myself, and I know that many people coming would prefer not to hear so many speeches, or at least so many long ones. So we started figuring out so many minutes per each speaker, and we found out that hardly any human being would be able to withstand that much sitting. And we finally started counting up as to how we could really compress so many speakers into a short period of time. And he hit up on an idea that if we could possibly get the Prime Minister to set the pace, and if he would accept a quota of 20 minutes, that then we could go to the other ministers and say, here, the Prime Minister accepted 20 minutes, then you should be satisfied with 15 or 10 so on down the line. And with that solution, he went to late Eshkol, and he got his commitment, and the problem was solved.
Can you remember any other specific things that Yakov did? Is there any speech that stands out in your memory particularly, or is there any crisis that stands out in your memory where it was a question of getting people to work together or getting them to agree to a certain formula in the drafts, or other things that he was involved in?
Well, now, Yakov's ability in speaking is something that's that impressed me very, very deeply, and that was at the meeting of the Presidium in Amsterdam, and practically every meeting that we had of the Presidium, he would always address give us a State of the Union, so as to say, talk as to what the conditions are, what the situation is. And he had an uncanny ability of speaking for 45 minutes without faltering for one word at any time during the whole conversation. He would never go over the same subject twice. He would never leave anything out. It was like a beautiful tapestry that he would weave, and from the beginning to the end he would weave it, and there were no holes and there were no overlaps. It was just a beautiful description and a beautiful explanation of whatever he was going to describe. And I've never met anyone in anywhere as a speaker that had this capability that Yakov had. And this wasn't only once or another time, it was every time. He just had that ability.
Kind of standard ability.
That was his ability. That was it. That was Yakov.
I wonder whether you can recall, while we're sitting here, any specific occurrences that where you had to go, let's say, to the Prime Minister to settle problems with him, or where there were difficulties within the Presidium or between the different countries, or anything specific that you can think of which would exemplify the way Yakov worked with you.
Well, there were many things. I don't remember any specific things, but there were many things in the Resolutions Committee where one continent would want something because of a particular need in that area, and another place it would be just the effect of it would be just the opposite. And it was hard to put both things in there, and Yakov would always take the two and work out a solution to where it could be put in such words that would satisfy both. And that's happened time and again at the different meetings.
Was he responsible for drafting most of the resolutions, or putting them into their final shape as they came from the members?
I think that he either was responsible himself or it was under his jurisdiction. And I think it was done, probably the important ones undoubtedly were done by him. Also, I think that he drew up a beautiful statement, Jerusalem statement, in the first conference that was read by Lord Zeef of London. That was really one of the most beautiful documents. I hope that you have that, and you have that to preserve that, because that was really one of the most beautiful statements I've heard. And this was done and prepared by Yakov.
Yeah, you're quite right. I remember that myself. Here's a little bit of a more difficult question. Do you want to take a break? No. The economic conference is now an established operation. We're going into our third conference. It's already borne a lot of fruit, and you've contributed a lot of your time and energy and efforts to it. So you're in a pretty good position to evaluate. What would it have been like without Yakov Herzog? This is another way of saying what his role was, you see.
Well, I would say that certainly it wouldn't have been like it has been, like it is now or will be now, if it had not been for Jackie. Because take, for example, the exhibit of the items produced in Israel. Now, when we were getting ready for the April '68 conference, there were a lot of debates about not having an exhibit. And I personally felt very strongly that there had to be an exhibit to show the items that were produced in Israel at that time, to show the world that Israel really is on a way in producing industrial and consumer goods. And even though perhaps we didn't have a complete line, but at least we had to show what we had. And we had arguments on that point. I think we spent hours and hours upon end about having it, and many of the government people thought that we shouldn't have it, it's a waste of money. And finally, Yakov felt that it really was important that we made the point, and he went to the bat to try to get this resolved. We got the approval. I think it was 250,000 pounds was the first appropriation to the, what is that company that sets up exhibits and...
I know which company you mean, yeah.
Anyway, so that company was allocated 250,000 pounds, and they set up the exhibit. And of course, after the conference, when everyone visited the exhibit, they were all very well pleased with it, and they thought it was wonderful that it was done. And since then, the different weeks, like the Metal Week and the Food Week and Chemical, all those weeks that are held now with all the exhibits of things that are made, are all the outcome, actually, of that particular first exhibit. And I'll never forget when I attended the first Metal Week conference, or Metal Week here, with the exhibit of the metal manufacturers. There were some 120 exhibitors, and when they came into the room and saw all of the metal industry of Israel represented, they themselves were very much surprised at what capability there was in Israel, because they never realized it. They were so busy within their own operation that they didn't realize what was happening in the rest of Israel.
The whole picture.
The whole picture. And here, for the first time, they saw the whole picture, and they were very well pleased with it. But I would say all of that is certainly because of Jackie. If it hadn't been for him, with that first exhibit, I don't think that these other weeks would have flown from it.
Right. That was in '68. Do you have any particular recall about preparations for the '69 conference, or any specific occurrence at the conference? You were saying, Mr. Carty, that you had no specific recollection of any incident in 1969, but in general, you found that Yakov played the role of oil on troubled waters. Would that be a kind of definition?
Well, it wasn't only that, but he had the tremendous ability to hear the sides and to even participate in them, and with that smiling face of his to bring people around to some common ground that everyone would agree upon. And it just had that uncanny ability of doing that. He would listen, but always had the smile, always had a way of controlling himself and to bringing it all together into an agreement.
Well, I thank you very much, and if in case you do think of something, I'm always available. Okay, thank you.
Since I've already put it on the record, I'll record it someplace else and send you a tape.
Very good. Thank you. This is an interview with Justice Israel Meisels of South Africa at the King David Hotel on February 6, 1973. Justice Meisel, I understand that you had met the late Yakov Herzog on a number of occasions, but that you really got to know him well in August 1967 at the Prime Minister's preliminary meeting for the founding the Economic Conference. Would you like to tell me something about that particular meeting?
Yes, what you say is absolutely correct. I had, of course, heard of Yakov Herzog. I had the pleasure of meeting with him on a few occasions, but the first time I really came into any sort of close contact with him was at that preliminary economic conference in August 1967. Now, of course, everybody was in a state of great excitement, the euphoria, one might call it, after the Six-Day War, and the presence of the Prime Minister, the late Mr. Levi Eshkol, and I remember General Dayan, and various other people addressed us. But if one were to ask the objective observer as to who was the dominant figure at that Congress, one would say, quite plainly, Yakov Herzog. Not, of course, because I'm not using the word dominant in the way in which it is very often used, but because his personality impressed itself on everybody so much, and because one realized that his was the guiding spirit and the brain behind the whole concept. Whenever he made a speech, whenever he made an announcement, he spoke with his usual clarity, and nobody who left that conference could ever have forgotten Yakov Herzog. From that time onwards, I may say, I made up my mind that if at all possible, I would try to get him to come to South Africa. Now, there's always been difficulty in getting, or at least there's been difficulty for some years in getting people who are associated with government to come to our country, and it was after a long and, well, I would almost say, bitter fight with some of the government authorities in Israel that we finally persuaded the government to permit Yakov Herzog to come to South Africa, which he did in May of 1971.
I thank you. We'll come back for a moment to the economic conference. You said it was his spirit. Was it the quality of his individual leadership, or was it because he was Prime Minister Eshkol's representative? And how did that express itself? If you could give me a concrete example, if at all possible, of how it came across.
Well, it wasn't, of course, because he was the Prime Minister's, how shall I call it, right-hand man. We knew he was. That, of course, was a great thing. But that wasn't the point. It was Yakov Herzog personally. Didn't matter what position he would have occupied. It was what he said and how he said it. One knew that here was a man, complete sincerity, with complete knowledge of what was required, and he had an ability to put it across in simple language to hard-headed businessmen. All the people of that economic conference were hard-headed businessmen. Of course, their hearts had been somewhat softened, perhaps, but not their heads, by what had happened in the months before.
When Dr. Herzog came to South Africa, what happened? What did he do? What did you ask him to do? How did he do it? And what effect did it have?
Well, first of all, I must explain that when Dr. Herzog came to South Africa, it was at great personal sacrifice. He had been ill, very ill, and it was very doubtful whether he would be allowed to come. He was keen to come because he wanted to do something, as he always wanted to do, for Israel and for the Jewish people. And when he came, he made the impact on the community that every one of us who had the privilege of meeting him fully anticipated and expected. He made this impact, first of all, because of the sincerity which I've already spoken about. He was received in South Africa. We consider ourselves a fairly warm community. He was received with even greater warmth than we receive normal visitors who come to us, distinguished visitors who come to us from other parts of the world, and particularly from Israel. He was received in this way because we realized that here was a man, one calls him a giant intellect, of course, that is so, but he was received in this way because we recognized him as a warm human being. Now, he addressed in meetings The main object of his visit was, of course, the Israel United Appeal campaign, and it was his visit which ensured the success of that campaign. He addressed large public meetings in the four main centres of South Africa, but in addition, he spoke to small groups of people. I don't have to speak of his qualities as an orator. I don't have to speak of that at all. Everybody knows it. But it was at the small gatherings where I thought he particularly shone, because his quiet personality, his unassuming and modest personality, was able to, how shall I say it, project itself better among smaller groups. This is my opinion, of course. Others may take a different view. There were some human incidents which I recall, perhaps, and one of which I should mention. There had been in Cape Town a rather tragic case in which a son of a prominent member of the community had been convicted of murdering his wife. Fortunately, he was not sentenced to death and is presently undergoing a long term of imprisonment. His father was alive at that time. He's since passed away. And his father was persuaded to come to a small gathering at the home of a good friend of Yakov Herzog's in Cape Town, a man called David Sussman. I was present that night. Yakov knew what had happened. He knew of the tragedy in this man's life. And Yakov got this man in a corner, quite unobtrusively. Nobody realized what was happening, but we saw that the two of them were actively engaged. And I could see, I didn't know what was said, of course, this was a private conversation, but one had the feeling that he had comforted this man, that he had given him new hope. And I can only say that afterwards, this man, who's now dead, and who was what we would call in his lifetime, if I may use a phrase, a tough customer, told me that he'd never met anybody like Yakov Herzog. This man, this old man, died a few months later. And just shortly before his death, he made a will. He bequeathed a sum well in excess of $1 million to Israel, to the Keren HaYesod, and I'm convinced in my own mind that Yakov Herzog's talk with him that night played a major part in his eventual gift. Let me give you another personal incident which showed the thoughtfulness of Yakov Herzog. My wife and I went to synagogue with him Shabbat evening, and afterwards we walked back to his hotel. The synagogue which we attended is the great synagogue in Johannesburg, and it's a fairly well-known place. Jacob was staying at a hotel a little distance away from the synagogue, and we walked back with him. He was kind enough to ask my wife and myself to have dinner with him and Penina in their suite of the hotel. We had somewhat stupidly arranged for his room to be as high as possible in the hotel. I think it was on the 16th floor, so that he should have some quietness. This hotel is situated in the city, and we didn't want him to be disturbed by any noises. But on that Shabbat Eve, or Friday evening, we realized, my wife and I, that we'd made a mistake. What happened was that when we got in the hotel, he said to us, "Will you two go up? I'll join you in a moment." I didn't realize what was happening, but my wife sensed, and she said to him, "You're not walking up, are you?" Now, not to embarrass us, he didn't answer that question directly. He said, "No, you just go up, which we did. And we then found that he had climbed 16 stories, not, of course, so that he shouldn't desecrate the Sabbath, and at the same time, he didn't want to make us feel uncomfortable at the thought that we were not doing what he very rightly did. My wife and I have often spoken about that incident because it seemed to us to be so typical of a person meticulous in his own observances but so tolerant of other people.
Would you, you mentioned earlier Yakov's first address after the long flight from Israel. He arrived that morning in May, and then was it at noon that he spoke to your leaders?
Yes. This address that he gave us was at lunchtime. I think the plane came in about somewhere between 9 and 10 o'clock. He hardly had any rest that morning. He came to a meeting of the executive of the South African Zionist Federation, and he gave an address, the like of which none of us had ever heard. It was a philosophical address on Zionism. And when he had finished, there was a silence, an appreciable moment of time, until, of course, the audience burst into applause. I was talking to a friend of mine who happens to be in Jerusalem from South Africa at this time, a man called Fritz Frank, who I think, like everybody else in South Africa who had the pleasure of meeting Yakov, got to love him. Fritz said he'll never forget that address as long as he lives, and I'm sure that speaks for all of us. As usual, he spoke without a note. And the poetry of the language, the loftiness of the thoughts was something which none of us can possibly hope to recapture. I was given the job of proposing a vote of thanks, and I can only say that it's one of the few occasions in my life where I was completely speechless. Nothing that I could have attempted to say would have done any sort of justice to the remarks that to the remarks that Yakov made that day. I need hardly tell you that the excitement in the community when he addressed the public meeting in Johannesburg, when he addressed a public meeting in Pretoria shortly after the Israel government had done what was considered an ill-advised act by giving some money to the Organization for African Unity. This meeting in Pretoria was quite a stormy one, or rather it was anticipated would be stormy because people came to this meeting very strongly critical of the action of the Israel government. After Yaakov Herzog had spoken, the criticism was very muted indeed.
I understand that you have brought with you the text of a vote of thanks you proposed at the Johannesburg City Hall. I don't want to ask you to read the whole thing into the tape recorder, but perhaps the first page or two, because there's, I understand, a quotation there from Gandhi, which was very important. Would you like to say something about that, and then we'd like to hear the first part of that vote of thanks?
Yes. Well, this vote of thanks of which you've spoken, as you say, was at the end of what we would call a great meeting in the City Hall of Johannesburg, attended by, I suppose, close to 2,000 people. The hall was packed. And we in South Africa have been very lucky because we've had great orators, great Zionists, great leaders, men like Chaim Weizmann, Ben Gurion, Moshe Sharet, Sokolov, Jabotinsky, all of whom have spoken in that same City Hall. And that night I said, and I repeat what I then said, that we had been privileged to hear an address which ranks amongst the greatest of all speeches we'd ever heard, in its conspectus, in its clarity, in the wealth of information given, and in the inspiration that it afforded everyone. There was one quotation to which you referred, which I had happened to pick up shortly before this meeting, and I thought I would include it. I'd like to read it. The reason why I would like to read it is because it apparently impressed itself both on Yakov and on Penina, who were there that night, and they asked me on a subsequent occasion if I could give them a copy of it. This is a quotation from a letter which Mrs. Gandhi, when she was 13 years of age, Mrs. Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, when she was 13 years of age, she received a letter from her father. Her father was then in prison. And he said this: ordinary men and women are not usually heroic. They think of their daily bread and butter, of their children, of their household worries and the like. But a time comes when a whole people becomes full of faith for a great cause, and then even simple men and women become heroes, and history becomes stirring and epoch-making. Great leaders have something in them which inspires a whole people and makes them do great deeds. That was the end of the quotation. I don't think would be in any way unduly flattering if I say that Yakov Herzog, in my opinion, and certainly in the opinion of those of us who were lucky enough to meet him, is one of those great leaders who had something in him which inspired Jewish people to do great deeds.
You'll be here till Friday, or can be in touch. If there's any specific incident which you recall until then, I'd be very grateful. I'll call you, say, at Friday noon, and come over and continually interview at your convenience. And if there's anything you think of in South Africa, I'd be very grateful if you could either dictate it or write it to us.
There's one thing I can tell you. There's one thing I would like to add. During his visit in South Africa, Yakov was suffering from a bad back. He used to lie down on the floor, try and get some comfort. He was due to leave South Africa one night, and the El Al plane was, as did not happen infrequently in those days, was late, and there was a 4-hour delay. Unfortunately, the day he had to leave, my wife met with a slight accident. And busy as he was, he and Pnina came to our home to say goodbye to us, a gesture which of course we appreciated beyond measure. But some of my friends were lucky enough to spend 4 hours that night talking to Yakov, waiting for the plane. They've told me that this was an example par excellence of Yakov Herzog, the raconteur. The stories he told them. I can mention some of the stories he told me. If I may mention the story he told me of the Friday evening, just at the end of the Six-Day War. He was telling us, really, the story which he was telling us about Miss Levi Eshkol's homely method of approach, if I may use that term. The attack on the Golan Heights was, of course, the last attack made, and the pressure was being brought in the United Nations by Russia, which was becoming more and more serious, and the Israel cabinet was in session during the whole of the Friday night, and the cabinet would resolve, after much hesitation, that although they had not yet reached the Golan Heights, perhaps they ought to stop and agree to a truce, which the Russians were at that stage pressing. And Eshkol said, well, after this decision, warte paar Stunden. And this went on throughout the night until about midday next morning, midday on the Shabbat, when General Dayan told them that the Israeli troops had scaled the heights and were on their way to Quneitra. He said they would have liked to have taken Quneitra, but perhaps they ought to agree at this stage. It was then resolved to telephone General Odd-Bull, and Israel would tender a truce, which they did, and General Odd-Bull, in his wisdom, decided that he wanted to see where the armistice line was. Naturally, the Israel government agreed. By the time General Bull arrived on the scene, Quneitra was in Israel's hands. Now, I've just given you the bare bones of the story, but Yakov Herzog's manner of telling that story and the way he told it was something which we can never forget. He told us many, many things of that nature, and of course, the pity is that nobody wrote them down at the time.
End of interview, which may be continued on Friday. End of interview.
Justice Meisels had nothing to add, and that completes the interview with him. On the other side of the tape, side B, will be recorded an interview with Rabbi Hershel Schachter. Please turn the tape over to the other side. Thank you.